Yemelyan Pugachev, a Don Cossack hardened by the 7 Years' War and the Russo-Turkish War, was no hero. He was a deserter, a vagrant, a man who had evaded the gallows for petty crimes. Yet it was this fugitive who, skillfully manipulating rumors of Emperor Peter III's miraculous survival, dared to undertake the most audacious scam of the 18th century. He declared himself the miraculously resurrected monarch, and like a spark in a powder keg, his words ignited a conflagration. Gathering Cossacks, serfs, and indigenous peoples under his banner, Pugachev transformed in mere weeks from a destitute imposter into a leader whose rebellion shook the foundations of the Russian Empire. He besieged the impregnable Orenburg, his punitive detachments ravaged provinces, and the name Tsar Peter Fyodorovich became a symbol of hope for millions and a terror for the ruling elite. Forget the tales of spontaneous peasant uprisings. What began on the Yaik River was not merely a surge of desperation, but a cold, calculated gamble on the deepest fears and aspirations of the people, a masterfully planned operation to subvert the state. But what drove Yemelyan Pugachev? What compelled an ordinary Cossack, even one with a criminal past, to challenge an empire? To understand the origins of this audacity, one must delve deeper into the grim details of his biography, into the fissures that irrevocably altered his consciousness. Pugachev was not born an imposter. He was a product of his time and his environment, ruthless, brutal, where law was merely a tool for the powerful, and survival demanded extraordinary cunning and absolute disregard for rules. Born in a Don Cossack village, he absorbed from a young age the Cossack spirit of freedom, intertwined with rebellion and disdain for any authority but their own. Then came the brutal meat grinders of the 7 Years' War and the Russo-Turkish War, where death was commonplace and human life was cheap. He saw people break, destinies shatter, and the state grind its soldiers into an anonymous mass. These years not only hardened him but burned away the remnants of his naivete, replacing them with cold cynicism and a profound sense of injustice. He witnessed veterans who had given their health and youth to their homeland return home destitute and unwanted. This was the first blow to his perceptions of duty and honor. The point of no return was not his petty thefts or desertions, but a series of arrests and escapes that turned his life into an endless pursuit. Each time he was caught, chained, or dragged in for questioning, what grew within him was not submission, but a visceral hatred for the system that pursued him. He saw the lawlessness of judges, the arbitrary rule of officers, the indifference of bureaucrats. And each escape, each time he outsmarted executioners and jailers, only reinforced his belief in his own exceptionalism, that he could outwit everyone. This life outside the law, on the very edge of the abyss, forged in him a unique blend of despair and an incredible, almost mystical certainty in his destiny. He became a man with nothing to lose, and this made him incredibly dangerous. In his mind, tormented by fear and hatred, the idea gradually matured that the only way to survive was not just to run, but to change the rules of the game, to break the very system that oppressed him. And if that meant becoming a dead emperor, then why not? He was already dead to his old life, and now he could be reborn to exact his revenge. But Pugachev's idea, however insane it seemed, fell on fertile ground that had long been prepared. The Russian Empire in the mid-18th century was not a monolithic power but a giant cauldron, boiling with internal contradictions and hidden conflicts. At the top of the pyramid sat Catherine the Great, an enlightened empress who had gained her throne not by birthright but by force, overthrowing her own husband, Peter III. This bloody coup left behind not only a shadow of doubt regarding the legitimacy of her rule, but also fertile ground for rumors of a miraculously saved emperor. In the popular consciousness, where the Tsar was God's anointed, not a puppet of the guard, this created a dangerous void that impostors eagerly sought to fill. Beneath this fragile political surface, an economic and social catastrophe was brewing. Millions of serfs, tied to the land and effectively sold into slavery to their landlords, lived in conditions that today would be called a humanitarian disaster. Their labor was squeezed to the last drop. Their children were torn from their families and sold like cattle, and any attempt at resistance was brutally suppressed. Serfdom reached its zenith. turning peasants into rightless slaves and stripping them of their last hope for justice. They were not a passive mass. They were a powder keg, waiting for a spark. An equally explosive force was the Cossacks, of the Don, Yaik, and Volga regions. Their traditional freedom, autonomy, and privileges were inexorably curtailed by imperial bureaucracy. The government consistently tightened the screws, attempting to transform free warriors into obedient state servants, seize their lands, and strip them of self-governance. For the Cossacks, whose identity was built on independence and a readiness to rebel, this was tantamount to a slow death. They felt betrayed and cornered, and their discontent grew like a snowball. Adding to this cocktail of despair were the non-Russian peoples of the Volga and Ural regions, the Bashkirs, Tatars, Kalmyks, and Mordvins. For centuries they had lived on their lands, preserving their culture and faith, but now groaned under the yoke of the Russian Empire's colonial policies. Their lands were seized, taxes rose, attempts were made to forcibly convert them to Christianity, and any attempt to preserve their distinct identity was suppressed by punitive army expeditions. For them, Pugachev, who proclaimed himself the good Tsar, promised not only freedom from serfdom, but also the restoration of their traditional way of life, protection of their faith, and justice. Thus, by the mid-1770s, the Russian Empire was not a monolithic power, but a ticking bomb, in which every social stratum and every ethnic group harbored grievances and yearned for change. Society was permeated by rumors, superstitions, and deep distrust of the ruling elite. It was in this atmosphere of widespread discontent, economic oppression, and political instability that Yemelyan Pugachev's scam not only gained a chance for success, but became inevitable. The winter of 1772 marked the time when Yemelyan Pugachev decided on his first exploratory move. He appeared in the lands of the Yaik Cossacks, meticulously spreading rumors of Emperor Peter III's miraculous survival, who had supposedly escaped death at the hands of Catherine's guards. This was not merely a rumor, but a subtle calculation. Pugachev knew that the Cossacks, stripped of privileges and cornered, desperately awaited a good Tsar who would restore their liberties. Initially, he acted cautiously, testing the waters and observing reactions. He managed to convince several dozen people that he was not a runaway Cossack, but the legitimate sovereign. However, this first attempt did not succeed. He was quickly arrested, tried, and imprisoned in the Kazan Ostrog. It seemed like the end of the story, but this was merely a prologue to the main act. 2 months later, in May 1773, Pugachev made his seemingly impossible escape. He didn't just escape, he vanished, dissolving into the boundless steppes, only to reappear with a new, far more audacious strategy. This was not merely an act of desperation, but part of his unique, ominous play. He understood that to ignite the flames, he needed not just a rumor, but a living embodiment of hope and vengeance. Returning to the Yaik, he no longer hid. On the contrary, he began openly, almost defiantly, asserting himself. He gathered around him the most desperate, the most aggrieved, those with nothing left to lose. Among them were Cossacks, runaway soldiers, and convicts. It was this motley but utterly devoted group that became the core of his second, far more successful performance. On September 28, 1773, at the Tolkachev farmstead, 50 versts from Yaik town, Yemelyan Pugachev, standing amidst hundreds of gathered people, officially declared himself Emperor Peter Fyodorovich. He didn't just speak words, he staged an entire spectacle, forged manifestos, promising freedom from serfdom, land, liberties, and no taxes, spread across the steppe. His associates, as desperate as he was, embraced and disseminated these promises, adding their own, even more radical ones. This was not merely a lie, but a masterful provocation, striking precisely at society's most vulnerable points. Pugachev didn't just incite rebellion, he gave millions what had been taken from them, hope for justice and the promise of vengeance against their oppressors. He didn't just assume another's identity, he became a living banner for all who hated the system. And this mystification, this cold-blooded gamble with others' lives, marked the beginning of the terror that engulfed the empire. By declaring himself Emperor Peter III at the Tolkachev farmstead, Pugachev did not merely challenge the system. He staged a cold-blooded spectacle, transforming the despair and ignorance of the masses into a potent weapon. His success lay not in military prowess or noble birth, but in a devilish ability to manipulate consciousness, building a myth around himself that defied logic. Pugachev's astonishing adaptability became his primary and most crucial tool. His arrest and escape from the Kazan Ostrog did not break him but served as a lesson. He understood. A spontaneous rumor wouldn't work. What was needed was not just a saved czar, but a living, tangible symbol capable of convincing everyone. And he began to act like a talented director, capable of changing the script on the fly. He didn't just declare himself a monarch, he played the part, imitating the manners and speech of the deceased emperor, though he had never seen him in person. This acting talent, combined with his personal audacity, created an aura of almost mystical power around him. Next, psychological tricks came into play. Pugachev masterfully played on the deepest fears and aspirations of the people. He didn't promise abstract justice but struck precisely at the target. He promised land, freedom, the abolition of taxes, and the end of hated serfdom. For the Cossacks, he promised the return of old liberties and privileges. For the indigenous peoples, he offered protection of their faith and traditions. He didn't just give hope. He offered a concrete, universally understandable path to a better life, liberation from specific daily sufferings. His manifestos, written in primitive language but striking at the very heart, flew across the provinces like sparks igniting dry grass. Beyond promises, Pugachev masterfully employed influence tactics, creating meticulously orchestrated hype around himself. He didn't just gather crowds. He staged public performances where his associates, former soldiers, runaway priests, Cossack elders, acted as witnesses to his miraculous survival. They swore to his authenticity, spreading rumors of his extraordinary power and his divine mission. These experts from the common people, who were trusted more than state officials, became his primary propagandists. They created a domino effect. Those they convinced, in turn, convinced others. He also skillfully exploited religious sentiments, proclaiming himself a good czar, sent by God to restore order and punish unrighteous landlords and officials. This gave his rebellion a sacred meaning, transforming it from an ordinary uprising into a holy war for truth. Any doubts about his identity were suppressed not only by threats, but also by the display of miracles or signs that his supporters interpreted as proof of his royal origin. Thus, Pugachev, possessing neither education nor high status, transformed his biography as a deserter and criminal into a legend of a miraculously saved czar. He was not merely an imposter, but a genius of manipulation who built an entire system of deception capable of convincing millions. It was this personal toolkit, a combination of desperate courage, acting talent, psychological acumen, and the ability to generate powerful informational buzz, that became the catalyst that transformed local unrest into a full-scale civil war. The full-scale civil war, which the preceding discussion foreshadowed, would not have begun without those who saw in Pugachev not merely an imposter, but a tool for achieving their own, far more pragmatic goals. Around the false emperor, like predators sensing blood, various elements immediately rallied, each of whom craved their piece of the crumbling empire. These were not only desperate peasants or rebellious Cossacks, but also far more calculating players. Among them stood out the Yaik Cossack elders, such as Ivan Zarubin-Chika and Afanasy Sokolov-Klopusha, who perfectly understood that before them was not Peter III, but a convenient puppet for their own advancement and the return of lost liberties. They did not believe in his royal origin, but they believed in the power of his name, capable of raising the masses. These experienced warriors and schemers became his military staff, the brains of the rebellion, channeling the blind fury of the people into organized resistance. They supplied him with information, developed tactics, and most importantly, maintained the myth of the good czar, knowing that without this legend, their own power would crumble to dust. They were joined by old believers, persecuted by the official church, who saw in Pugachev a messiah who would end their suffering. For them, he was not just a czar, but almost a saint, a harbinger of a new, righteous world. Their support was no less crucial, for it gave the rebellion a religious, almost fanatical dimension, transforming it into a struggle for faith. It was they who helped spread the forged manifestos, copying them by hand and disseminating them to the most remote corners of the empire, where every word of the Tsar was received as the ultimate truth. But if Pugachev was the catalyst and his associates the driving force, then the true antagonist, whose fate became inextricably linked with this chaos, was Catherine the Great. The Empress, accustomed to holding all the reins of control over a vast empire, faced a challenge unlike any she had known in all her years of rule. For her, Pugachev was not just an imposter, but a living embodiment of her worst nightmares: the instability of the throne, the memories of the bloody coup that brought her to power, and the potential for a rebellion capable of toppling the entire dynasty. Initially, she underestimated the threat, viewing the uprising as a localized Cossack rebellion that a few army detachments could easily suppress. But when the rebels began to ravage cities, and the name Peter Fyodorovich echoed from the Urals to the Volga, Catherine realized the full depth of the catastrophe. This was not merely a revolt, but a war against her authority, against the entire system she had so meticulously built. The Empress's reaction was twofold. On one hand, she displayed feigned composure to avoid panic, but on the other, she secretly despaired from the court, understanding that her enlightened rule could end in disgrace and bloodshed. She threw her best troops against Pugachev, even calling upon renowned generals like Alexander Suvorov. For her, suppressing this rebellion became a matter not only of prestige, but also of the empire's survival, and crucially, her own power. She could not allow this peasant czar to destroy all she had created and reveal to the world the fragility of her throne. It was the confrontation between these two figures, an imposter playing the role of a czar and an empress desperately clinging to her real throne, that transformed a local uprising into a full-scale bloodbath, splitting the empire in two. The divided empire ignited. The name Peter Fyodorovich swept on the wind, embraced by millions yearning for freedom and vengeance. After his triumphant declaration, Pugachev wasted no time, transforming the desperate masses into an army that spread terror throughout the Volga and Ural regions. Cities fell one after another, estates burned, and nobles and officials perished under the axes of the rebels. The rebellion, which began as a Cossack uprising, rapidly escalated into a full-scale social war, where good Tsar Pugachev symbolized bloody retribution. He besieged Orenburg, but the city held, and this protracted siege became the first crack in his strategy. However, this did not stop him. The campaign against Kazan became the peak of the Pugachev Rebellion, its bloody climax. In July 1774, after months of guerrilla warfare and terror, Pugachev moved his main forces toward the capital of the Kazan Governorate. The capture of this large city, one of the empire's most important centers, would have meant not only a military victory, but also a colossal psychological blow to Catherine. And he succeeded. The rebels, like a wild torrent, stormed the city, unleashing a bloody massacre on nobles, officials, and clergy. Kazan's prisons were opened, and the city ignited, turning into hell. This was the moment when Pugachev seemed to reach his apotheosis, holding the key to further advance on Moscow. He was on the verge of becoming not just a regional nightmare, but a threat to the very heart of the empire. But it was here, in the ashes of Kazan, that his grand scam began to unravel. As soon as the city was captured, Colonel Ivan Michelson's corps, an experienced commander who had never known defeat, approached. This was not just a regular army, but a ruthless machine, capable of methodically grinding any mob. Michelson attacked immediately, giving Pugachev no time to consolidate his position. The battle that unfolded beneath the walls of burning Kazan became a disaster for the imposter. His motley army, composed of peasants, Cossacks, and irregular formations, could not withstand the onslaught of disciplined soldiers. Thousands of rebels were killed, hundreds captured, and Pugachev himself barely escaped by fleeing across the Volga. The defeat near Kazan became his fatal error, a point of no return. He lost not only his army, but also his belief in his invincibility, and, crucially, the myth of the Tsar savior began to unravel. After Kazan, the rebellion lost its organized character. It devolved into a desperate but chaotic chase, where Pugachev, pursued by regular troops, darted across the steppes, trying to regroup. His tactics devolved into total terror, burning estates, and massacres of nobles, which only alienated those who still harbored doubts. Catherine's forces, reinforced by regiments transferred after the end of the Russo-Turkish War, including detachments commanded by Suvorov himself, methodically cleared the rebellious areas. The noose tightened, and Pugachev's associates, seeing inevitable collapse, began to consider their own salvation. The myth of the miraculously saved Tsar, which had recently seemed unshakable, finally dissipated. The final act of this bloody drama unfolded in late August 1774. After another devastating defeat near Tsaritsyn, the remnants of Pugachev's army dwindled to a pathetic handful of cornered animals. His closest confidants, including the Yaik Cossack elders, who had initially elevated him to his pedestal, now saw him only as a burden. They knew that Catherine did not forgive betrayal, but would pardon those who helped capture her enemies. On the night of August 28th, on the banks of the Uzun River, in the boundless Trans-Volga steppes, a group of conspirators led by Cossacks Ivan Tvorogov, Fyodor Chumakov, and Ivan Fedolev attacked the sleeping Pugachev. They bound him, betraying him into the hands of government troops. Thus ended the most audacious scam of the 18th century. The emperor turned out to be an ordinary Cossack, bound and humiliated, his power a phantom that dissolved into the steppe air. The captured, shackled Pugachev was delivered to Yaik town, and then, under heavy guard, in an iron cage, sent to Moscow for public exposure and inevitable execution. It was the end not only of the rebellion, but also of the myth he had so masterfully created and in which millions had believed. As the iron cage carrying Pugachev rolled towards Moscow, the empire continued to bleed for a long time from the turmoil his rebellion had unleashed. The Ural mining and industrial regions, the heart of Russian industry, were turned into scorched earth. Dozens of iron and copper factories were destroyed or shut down. Thousands of workers, many of whom were assigned peasants, either perished, fled, or joined the rebellion. Investors who had poured colossal funds into these enterprises faced utter ruin. The profits they anticipated turned to ashes, and restoration required not only enormous infusions of capital but also a complete overhaul of the management system. For Catherine the Great, the suppression of the rebellion was not merely a victory, but a bitter lesson. The empire suffered colossal financial losses. Military expenditures amounted to millions of rubles, and the damage from destroyed cities, villages, and enterprises was irreparable. To erase even the memory of the rebellion, the Empress ordered the Yaik River to be renamed the Ural, and the Yaik Cossack host into the Ural Cossack host. This was not merely a symbolic gesture, but part of a large-scale campaign to strengthen centralized power and eliminate any pockets of autonomy. Catherine realized that enlightened absolutism was impossible without strict control over the entire territory. Soon after the suppression of the revolt, in 1775, a provincial reform was carried out that significantly enlarged administrative units and strengthened the vertical of power. The number of provinces increased to 50, each receiving stricter control from the center. This allowed for more effective suppression of any local discontent and quick quelling of potential rebellions. The police force was strengthened, and army garrisons were stationed in strategically important locations. But the most terrible consequence of the Pugachevshchina was the unimaginable tightening of serfdom. Instead of the promised freedom, the peasants found themselves in an even more disenfranchised position. The fear of a new rebellion forced the nobility and the government to tighten the screws even further, stripping serfs of even the faintest hopes of liberation. This was the bloody price the empire paid for its stability, and it laid a heavy burden on the shoulders of millions. However, even after the iron cage delivered the imposter to Moscow and his head fell from the block, the story of Yemelyan Pugachev did not end. On the contrary, it was only just beginning, mutating from a bloody chronicle into a popular legend. For decades, the empire tried to erase his name from memory, renaming rivers and military units, but to no avail. The more fiercely the authorities tried to demonize the peasant czar, the more firmly he became entrenched in the minds of millions as an avenger and liberator. This was Pugachev's greatest paradox. He, a fugitive criminal and a bloody dictator who hid behind another's name, went down in history not as an unrepentant villain, but as a symbol of resistance. Imperfect, brutal, yet still a symbol. His rebellion, which claimed tens of thousands of lives, was in fact the last great gasp of despair before the final encirclement of the peasantry. In popular memory, he became not an imposter, but a good czar, who wanted freedom but was betrayed. The myth of him, distorted and embellished, proved stronger than the truth itself, because it offered hope where there was none left. The story of Pugachev is not merely the chronicle of a mad rebellion. It is a universal lesson about what happens when power loses touch with reality and a system drives people to despair. It shows how easily myth can replace facts when there is a deep-seated need for change in society, even if that change carries the banner of falsehood. Yemelyan Pugachev may have been merely a cunning deserter, but his legacy forever remains a living embodiment of popular anger that, if left unchecked, can tear an empire apart.